So I thought we'd get started. And if the clicker wants to click. Yep, there. Hello, my name is Linda Lawton, and I'm here because I love identity servers. And I ran across an identity server recently that had some issues. And I thought I would share those issues with you so that maybe you can avoid some issues. So I have worked as an application developer for more than 25 years. I graduated in 1994. Back then, we did not have Windows. Everything was DOS-based. My most recent position, I was the lead developer on an identity server for application, which used .NET Core, of course, and entity framework. I am a big fan of Stack Overflow. You will probably run across me on there from time to time. I have been writing blogs and tutorials since probably around 2000. My most recent blog has been live since 2014. Most of what I do on that blog previously was related to Google APIs and .NET, and recently I have been going more over to the .NET Core side and Identity Server just because that's what's fun for me right now. I am also a Google Developer Expert. Does anybody here know what a Google Developer Expert is? Have you heard of a Google Developer Expert? Google Developer Experts is Google's version of the Microsoft MVP program. I have 2 Google Developer Expert tags. I was actually the 5th woman worldwide to be granted a Google Developer Expert tag. I have one for Google Analytics and the other one for Identity Platform. I am a contributor on the Identity Server 4 project, open source project, and the Google.NET Client Library. When I say contributor, I mean I like to help out. I help with the issues on the forums. I write documentation. I write tutorials and sample projects. Occasionally, I will send in a bug fix. I feel that these projects all have their own lead developers who know what they're doing and are perfectly capable with that. A lot of these projects do not have people like me who like to write documentation, like to help developers use their projects, and just like to write sample code just because it's fun on my spare time. So that's a little bit about what I am and what I do. So what are we going to talk about today? Besides clicker not working. Has anybody ever heard of a lost puppy project? Okay. This is a little pet name that I've given it. Let's see if maybe I can clue you in on this. A lost puppy project, in my opinion, is you find a new framework online, you get this great idea, maybe it's a new library. Hey, let's make an identity server. This could be a lot of fun, right? I mean, everybody needs an identity server. We've never created one of these before. Let's make an identity server. So everybody in the team gets together. Hey, cool, this is a great idea. We are going to make an identity server. So next thing you know, you've got everybody together on this, and then we're all making an identity server, and everybody loves this puppy project. This is a little puppy, and he's so cute, and he's fluffy, and he does all kinds of fun things. The next thing you know, 2 or 3 months goes by, and wait a minute, we need to add something to the puppy project. So, okay, John, he's got 5 minutes, so John will go ahead and do it. And John goes in and he fixes something with it. And next thing you know, 6 months goes by, we got to do something else with it. Nobody wants to play with this puppy anymore. Nobody knows what the puppy, I mean, honestly, anything you write 6 months ago, you're not going to remember what it was. I don't even remember what I wrote 6 weeks ago. So all of a sudden, you've got this lost little puppy project that nobody really wants to play with anymore, but guess what? It's in production and everything's using it. So I was hired to work at a company, originally to work on the main web application in the backend. And about 3 weeks after I was hired, the contractor that they had was leaving. and he was the one that was in charge of the Lost Puppy project at the time. And nobody else wanted to deal with this identity server. So I said, fine. I have worked on Google's identity server for a long time. I'm a Google developer expert for identity platform. I know how to connect to an identity server. How hard can it be to work on the back end of an identity server? Sounded like fun to me. Sure, I'll do it. So that's how I ended up working on the identity server. Now, I'm going to give you a few quick key tips to get you going on this so that we understand each other when I'm talking here. A client application is your application wanting to connect to the identity server. This is a client application. The API is your group of functions that you want your client application to be able to access, right? The user is the one that owns the data, who has to grant you access to use this data. Then we have the main difference, the difference between an ID token and an access token. This is where a lot of people in the start misunderstand the two different things. An ID token you should think of as your birth certificate, or as the user's birth certificate. An ID token identifies the user who is physically logging into your application right now. Okay, fine. Who uses the ID token? Your client application will use the ID token. Your client, I've seen a lot of it, is the client application uses the ID token to see what language this user is currently using, to show the name up in the corner that this is who the user is, correct? I hope you're with me so far. Okay, so now we are over to the access token. Well, what's an access token then? The access token is more like your driver's license. The access token says that this user has permissions to drive. Or it could be whether or not this user is allowed to drink. In the United States, you have to be 21 to drink. As far as I remember, you still have to be 21 in the United States. So who uses the access token? Well, the API uses the access token. So your client logs in, the client is returned an ID token and an access token. The client uses the ID token to say, okay, this is John logging in, fine. Then the client application will send the access token over to your API and request data back using the API, using the access token. No, I'm gonna start using the arrows now. So let's go and look at a basic access token and ID token. Like I said, Google Developer Expert, I took Google's access token and ID token. An ID token, for the most part, is a JWT, which you can use jwt.io to go in and decrypt for yourself, so that you can go in and you can see the claims that are inside of this ID token. Once you know what claims are inside of your ID token, you can then see the difference. With an access token, those are not always JWTs. There's no claims or no tokens inside of these. It's just decrypted by the actual API to know who has access. So, what happened when I took over this identity server? Well, the first thing I did was I said, okay, I want to see the claims. I want to see what this thing is returning. And this is what I was faced with. That's a lot bigger than the first one, isn't it? There's a lot more stuff in here. And I was like, okay, you know what? I didn't know you could add more claims to your token. I thought that was pretty cool in the start. But now here's what we're going to do. We are going to start picking apart that token. I've got 5 points for you, and we're going to go through each one of them. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are interesting. Let's see how it goes. The first one is email. Returning a user's email information. If you feel like reading the RFC for OpenID Connect. I personally will recommend it if you ever have issues sleeping at night. Read that bedtime story. Really great. You'll sleep like a baby. So inside the RFC for OpenID Connect, it says that email is an optional scope that requests access to the email and the email verified claims. Okay, makes a lot of sense. So it's an optional scope that your client can say to a user, we want to see this user's email information. Well, that's perfectly fine. So this is returned in our claims. The user info is returned, email and email verified. Well, that was kind of cool, so it's obviously working, except that if we look at the actual token and we look at the scopes that the client sent to return the information, there's no email scope there. So somebody went in and hard-coded added returning the email claims to the identity server. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? First of all, it's probably against the recommendations in the RFC. But you also have to think about the fact that the scopes are asking the user, asking you, can I see your email information? You want to run my client, you want to run my application, and I'm going to ask you, I need to see your email application, and I'm going to ask you, can I see your client? Or can I see your email? And you have the option to say yes or no. Now, this isn't always the case. As far as I know, if you ask Google for email claim, Google does not request consent from the user. Some authorization servers do, some don't. Google's doesn't, as far as I know. In my opinion, if you are going to ask me to see my email, I want to know it. I don't want some authorization server just returning my email information without them knowing it. Unfortunately, this server was. That was one of the things I fixed first. So it no longer does that. So, back to the puppy project idea. So you want to create a new identity server. What's the first thing you do? Identity server tutorials. Cool. You find an identity server tutorial. Find a really nice identity server tutorial, and you go ahead and you copy the tutorial and you put all the stuff in and you pop it off into test, and the next thing you know, it's in production. And you copied everything, including the API name. So now you have an API in production. What would you like to name your API? Bob's Bank Data. Oh, that would be a good API name. User email system information. I don't know. But personally, I would not call it Test API. Unfortunately, the last I knew, Test API was still in production. This was one of the things I did not have time to fix. So, if you have a puppy project, can you be nice to your puppy project? I know it's really easy to just go Stack Overflow, copy code, dump it in. I do it all the time. We all do. We're in a hurry. We don't have time. But sometimes it's a good idea to stop, read through what it is that you're putting into production and not put Test API into production. It just looks bad. I mean, if it was just an internal API, then maybe it wouldn't matter that all of your internal developers know that we have Test API. This, unfortunately, was not. This was live. This was third-party developers connecting to Test API. Wouldn't have been that hard to fix, just not something that was on my table to fix it. You can actually create a new API, and then all new clients would use the first one, and then you have to start contacting all the developers saying, please stop using Test API. And then eventually just shut it down and then wait for people to scream. So that was number 2. Now, I promised you a what could possibly go wrong, and that was my mission to get you all here. Come to my first talk at NDC. So, what could possibly go wrong? Business data. How big is too big? When you're access token and your ID token are built, how much information can you stuff in there? If you're using this as a data store, how big can these tokens be? Theoretically, they can be really, really, really big. But if you make them really, really big, what happens? So this is the business data that was in the token. Now, all of it, or most of it, looks pretty reasonable, except if you notice application ID. Application ID is an array. Okay. So let me try and explain how this application worked. This was an application where users could have access to multiple companies. Each company could then have more than one application installed, plugin applications installed. So, to build this claim, they created a hard coupling between the identity server and the API. So now to build the claims, the API had to, for one, it had to be up. So if the API went down, the identity server was down, because now we couldn't request these claims. So first of all, you'd have to go over and you'd have to get a list of all of your companies. So there was an endpoint on the API. We'd go over and we'd list all of our companies. Get it returned back to the identity server. Fine, not a problem. Then for each one of those companies, we'd go and we'd make a request asking for each one, all the apps for this company, which was, again, okay, except if you had some users that had access to more than 20 companies. 20 companies, 10 apps each. You've got a number of requests going back and forth to this API. Not only was it hard on the API, but why was it hard on the API? That's because it was built, the tokens were being built 4 times. Wait a minute, what do you mean the tokens are being built 4 times? Why are the tokens being built 4 times? It was built once for the ID token. It was built again for the access token. You have the option with Identity Server 4 to include your claims inside the access token. Why do they need to be there? I don't know. They were. So you're building it once for the ID token, once for the access token. Why is it building 4 times? You just said 2, Linda. That's because, again, you have a puppy project. You were in, you made a change, Tom comes in, Tom makes a change, Tom decides he's going to move this line to this line, copy stuff, something gets missed in the code review, and all of a sudden, you're building the cookie twice. So it took me 3 months to find a 1-line code where here it was building the cookie, and the next thing you know, it's rebuilding the cookie. So this was done 4 times. Once, request all your companies. Then each company, request all your apps. This became a pretty big issue. But that's okay, right? I mean, it's only done once an hour. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Because in ASP.NET, there was something called the Security Token Validator. Well, what's that? The Security Token Validator is there for something called Logout Anywhere. If a user changes their password on their phone, then it should automatically log them out on their tablet, on their desktop, on their kid's PC. And this is done through a security token on the user's account inside. I think it's inside ASP.NET Identity. Security token validation was done every 5 minutes on this system. So I want you to go in and start thinking, how many calls is this doing back and forth to this API, rebuilding these tokens back and forth and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's basically the same information because it's not changing all that often. So, well, now you've got one of the issues, that it's building all this. Now let's talk about cookies. We all like cookies. I like cookies. Do you like cookies? Browsers have limits. There are limits to the number of cookies, there are limits to the cookie size, and there are limits to the number of headers in your browser. Here are some numbers from a website that I found, and I'm hoping they are reasonably accurate. Chrome allows you 180 cookies, Firefox 150, Edge apparently 180 as well. Now let's look at the max cookie size. Does anybody know why we can't have a standard max cookie size? I mean, these guys don't talk at all, do they? I mean, they really don't. They really should. But okay, so we've got 3 different max cookie size, but there is a max cookie size. Okay, so if I have a token that is this big, and it needs to be, first of all, it needs to be encrypted, and for some reason, ASP.NET, it encrypts these cookies into, I don't know what it does, but it's pretty cryptic to what it does to them, but it makes them huge. I mean, really, 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 really big. So what are we going to do with these really big cookies? Well, then we have something called the Cookie Chunking Manager. Oh my God, I love that name. Cookie Chunking Manager. Whoever named that should get a bonus. That's just great. Chunk up your cookies. Let's chunk a cookie. So basically what the Cookie Chunking Manager does is it goes in and it says this cookie is too big, so I'm going to chunk it up into pieces so that it'll go back to this user, into the user's browser. But then what you end up having is you end up having multiple cookies. Now, it works. It actually does. It works fine. No problem. Except when you have, I had a couple of users. Now, I don't know why it didn't hit them every time, but occasionally, and I think one of them was a supporter who had access to like 150 companies. I mean, who needs access to 150 companies? And each one of these apps, and it was building a huge cookie for them. And I think there was up to 12 chunks at once. I saw a picture of it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find it to put in the slides because it would have been really impressive. But yeah, but that's okay, isn't it? Nope. Kong has limits too. Now, I'm going to come clean. I am not a server infrastructure person. I think I know what Kong is. It's some kind of a, it has something to do with load balancing in the API gateway and stuff. But unfortunately, we started getting these errors from Kong, and Kong is like, my headers are too big, and I'm like, what do you mean your headers are too big? What's too big here? I have no idea. So I'm like, telling my boss, fine, we've got to remove this, and he's like, it apparently there is a really, really, really big header somewhere in Nginx, and it was kicking it out. And that's because the default size was 8K. So I'm telling my boss, well, we're going to remove this. And we went back and forth, and they're all like, we can't. We need it. We need to have the all of these claims inside of the token. We had applications. He kept telling me we got applications and lots of applications that need all of these claims. They're using them, then we need them, and we can't get rid of them. And I'm like, we've got users that are getting Kong errors. What's worse? I mean, Kong errors. That's not even a 400 error or 500. That's a Kong error. That can't be good. So what are we gonna do? Well, I Googled around a bit, did some checking on. I think I found a comment somewhere in GitHub that said that you could set the buffer size up. And if you ever run into this Kong error, here's the fix for it, because it actually does work. It took me 2 weeks to convince the server administrator to please go in and change the settings in Kong. And yes, I know I don't really know what Kong does, but they said that this will fix the bug. And sure enough, it gave us some breathing room. It did actually fix it. We no longer got Kong errors, but now we had really big header sizes in Kong, and my server administrator wasn't really happy with that. So back to the token again. it's still really, really big. I mean, what are we going to do with this? Well, we had to go in and skinny it up. It took me 4 months to convince management and all of my fellow developers that having a hard coupling between the identity server and the API was a bad idea, and that the ID token and access token were not meant to be a data store. This is not what you were supposed to be using these for, and we needed to remove this. To get it removed, it turned out that there were only 2 applications that were actually using the claims out of 40 or 50 that they told me were probably using them. So the first application, I think it took them 2 months to remove most of it. The second one was actually the main application. It took them a bit longer. I think it took them more than 3 months, but it had to do with the fact that at the same time we took on moving it over to ASP.NET Identity instead of using a homegrown login system. So it was how long it actually took to remove it from them, I don't know. But it took 3 months before all of this was removed and in production. And at the time I left, this is the shiny new access token. Much cleaner, isn't it? And look, email claims there. Or email scope, sorry. So that fixed the main issue. So why was this a problem? This was a problem because as a puppy project, there was nobody that had the confidence to say to management, we shouldn't do this. Nobody had the background knowledge of using an identity server to say to management, we really, really shouldn't do this. So that's why I'm saying that if you have a puppy project, which is fine. I mean, some projects are really great to be just a little puppy project. Let's create a new thing with Angular and have a blast. But you still need to have somebody. Somebody needs to own these projects. Somebody needs to say that I will love this puppy and I will make sure that we are not putting something in production that's a really, really bad idea. And I know it's hard. We all move on to different projects and we all run out of time. But something like an identity server, this can't happen. Identity servers, this is user's login system. This is the user's information here. This really, really can't happen. So that's why we need to be careful. Now, this one, I'm going to let you decide. Because this is one of the ones that I didn't change. I left this. And that's because I have a bad habit of being of 2 minds. Part of me says, this is a bad idea. The other part of me says, it doesn't matter that much. So I couldn't really decide if this was an issue or not. These are 2 claims. One is supporter and the other one is supporter. Supporter just so happens to be your subject ID, the user's user ID. So the way this system worked was that we had a lot of, in Danish we call them håndværkere, users that I want to say work with their hands, but it's plumbers and carpenters and users like that. And a lot of times they are out and working for customers, right? And they have a little app and they're doing the little app here. But then they get a bug in the system and they have an issue with their account or they need to fix something, but the app, it doesn't support that. So they need to contact our support department and the support department logs in, takes control of their account and fixes it for them. Because these users can't use TeamViewer on a mobile device over at Aunt Tanya's house. It just doesn't work. So we had this support system. The way it worked was that there were 3 or 4 undocumented API endpoints. And with these undocumented API endpoints, it used a policy to check whether or not the user logging in using this endpoint had the supporter claim. As long as they had the supporter claim, they were allowed to use this endpoint. So these are undocumented endpoints. So why did I have an issue with this? Well, I have an issue with this because these 2 claims were returned on every client, not just our internal clients, not just the client that actually used these endpoints. It was returned on every single client. So if Tom's Car Wash created a new app to use this system, and I logged in with supporter access, Tom's Car Wash would know that I have supporter access. Well, is that an issue? I don't know. Can Tom's Car Wash maybe find these API endpoints that aren't documented? Because what we're talking about right now is security by obscurity. We are assuming that it's safe because nobody can find these endpoints. How are they going to find the endpoints? Honestly, I don't know, and I think that's part of the reason why I left this. My original idea was to lock it down to a client so that only the internal client, there were 2 of them that I knew of that used these endpoints, only those would have these claims returned, and that would have made a lot of sense. But to figure out how to do it wasn't something that I had time. It just wasn't prioritized, and again, I couldn't decide on my own whether or not this was a good idea or not. So that one I left alone and decided it is what it is, but it's still sitting there probably as a issue on Jira. Here's another one. Let's talk about time. Anybody else a Star Trek fan? Deanna Troy. Time is a really interesting thing. What is the standard lifetime of an ID token and an access token? Now, I wasn't actually able to find anywhere that a standard ID token lifetime was written down. I think the default in Identity Server 4 is about 5 minutes. Basically, an ID token, you should only use it in your client to figure out who just logged in and then chuck it. I mean, you wouldn't really keep it around. You don't really need it for anything. An access token, on the other hand, I believe we can agree that the industry standard for an access token lifetime is an hour. Well, why is that? Well, that's because if somebody managed to get a hold of your access token in that hour's time, the data leakage would be minor. I mean, what can they do in an hour? So normal systems, as far as I know Google's about an hour. I think Twitter's about an hour as well. So an hour seems good to me, right? An hour seems fine. And I just did that one. That was an extra slide I threw in there. I think I forgot that slide. Okay, so now I have another story for you. As you can see, I like stories. So, local, DADK. This is the claim for a user's language. So this returns as part of the ID token so that you know what language the current user is using, which is fine. Then I had a supporter contact me. And I had a really nice reputation with this supporter. I knew her very well. And she was really cool. And she contacted me and she said that I have a user who just changed their language. And for some reason, it's the application isn't changing the language. So I was like, okay. Went over, I contacted the developer in question, and I said, where are you guys reading this language from? I mean, are you reading for the database? Are you getting it for the user info endpoint? Are you reading it from the token? And he says, yeah, we're grabbing it from the token. I assumed he meant access token, ID token, because I knew, at that point, I knew that they were reading these claims out of the access token rather than the ID token, and that was part of the problem. Part of the thing I had to do was get them away from reading these kind of claims out of the access token. I wanted to get them out of the access token. It's like, okay, fine. So I contacted her and I said, the access tokens are an hour long. They're reading it out of the token. You're going to have to wait until the user logs in again or until the access token times out and it grabs a new one. And she says, I already did that. And I was like, wait a minute, you already did that. Now, normally I'd say, try again. I don't believe you. But I knew this supporter, and I knew her, and I knew, she said, I already did that. So she had tried, and I knew her well enough to know that she hadn't tried just once. She'd tried 2 or 3 times. So I was like, okay, you've tried. All right, fine. Tomorrow's Friday, my 20% time, I'll take a look at your bug. So the next day, I pulled up my machine. I left it sitting there, went back an hour later. Nope, didn't change my language. What's going on here? Couldn't figure it out. So then I pulled up my own machine, and I started trying it on my machine. Hey, wait a minute. Works on my machine. You guys haven't heard that one before, have you? Yeah, worked fine on my machine. Yes, it works. No problem. No problem, so there can't be an issue. Nope, it didn't work on the server. Great. Okay, so maybe there's something wrong with the server. The server guy must have hated me because first there was a Kong issue, now there's a token issue. All right, no, okay, we're not going to call him. So I figured, what's the first thing I'm going to do? Well, fine. Let's see if we can figure out if there's a difference between the client on my machine and the client up on the server. What could be the difference here? Why is this working on my machine and not on the server? Or on the server but not on my machine? Well, that's because we have 14A access tokens. So why do we have 14A access tokens? That took a little bit of digging. Apparently, Remember Me wasn't working. And cookie sliding wasn't working. Which, Remember Me is that when a user logs in, and then they log in tomorrow, they don't have to retype their password. I'm sure if you've done this on, if you log in on Stack Overflow, for example, you don't have to type your password every day. You don't have to type your password every day in Google either. That's cookie sliding, and that's Remember Me. Remember Me normally works on the machine type of thing, but it remembers who you are logged in. And apparently the issue was that the users were being randomly kicked out of the machine, out of the system every hour or so and being forced to log in again. And then if one of them shut down the machine and started it up again, they'd be logged in again. And rather than figuring out why the little puppy was broken and why Remember Me wasn't working, the decision was to set the access token to 14 days. That was a great decision. Well, why was that a bad decision? Well, think of this. We've already seen what was in this, the business data that was in this. So Jane has access to your company, and that's in the access token. Well, Jane's been a bad girl. We just fired Jane. But you know what? Jane still has a 14-day access token on her machine. She can still do whatever she wants, can't she? She could. The access token's still valid. What's validating it now? Luckily, the API in the back end, I did check this because I was panicking here. I was like, wait a minute, somebody's going to get fired, and this isn't going to work. But I did some checking. The API was doing a double check. The API was not using the claims as a policy to validate whether or not the user had access to something, which made me very happy at the time, because I was really worried about this. But what it did mean was that if the user changed their language settings, that it wasn't going to update for 14 days. So I ended up having to tell her, you're going to have them log out and log in again, and then it'll pick it up, which, lucky for me, it actually did, which was really good. Unfortunately, it took a little longer to get Remember Me working. I did in the end get it working. But one of the things I did do, a little sneaky of me, was that the first thing I did was I went in to all of the clients in the test database and I updated everybody to 1 hour access tokens, and I waited for somebody to scream. Nobody screamed. So then a couple of weeks later, I kind of whispered at one of my coworkers, and I says, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to update them all in production, but I'll leave yours. I left the 2 main applications. I says, I'm going to leave these 2, but I'm going to go out, update everybody else. I'm going to wait for everybody else to scream. Nobody else screamed. And then we started dealing with the 2 main applications, and that's when I had to actually go in and fix the issues with Remember Me and the sliding cookie. There was unfortunately one application that I was not able to get sliding cookie to work properly in, and I think it had to do with the fact that it was a very old version of Owen, and it's been a long time since I have touched that, and I wasn't very familiar with that application enough to be able to go in and try and fix this. I tried 3 or 4 times to fix it, never got it fixed. I managed to convince them to let me reduce the length of time on the access token to 8 hours instead of 14 days, which seems to have worked. So, I mean, at least we've gotten that. But unfortunately, I no longer work for this company, so I wasn't able to continue working on this issue. Now, I forgot to set my timer, so I have no idea how I am time-wise. So I'm going to give you a little recap about everything we talked about. Remember to watch it out with the scopes, and watch out when you are adding your claims manually to Identity Server. Make sure that you don't just go and start adding stuff because it might sound like a really good idea. Yes, you can, but it's probably not a really good idea. You need to know what you're doing. If you're going to copy code, even if it's Identity Server, I don't care where you're coming from, at least skim it. Don't just put test API in production, please. Remember not to overload your tokens. Like I said, you are more than welcome to add extra claims to the tokens. There are a few claims that I could validly think of. It's a good idea to add them. Remember not to add anything that will change regularly, because if you've got an hour access token, you shouldn't be updating anything that's going to expire in an hour. And then, of course, tokens have a lifetime for a reason. And then don't forget your puppy project. Love your puppy project. You know, for some reason out there, you spent your time creating this project, and you loved it at one point. And I know we all move on. But don't forget about it. Love it, enjoy it, have fun with it, you know, go back to it every now and then. Own it. This is a child. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of these projects I've worked on, I consider them my babies. Probably not. My babies have gotten big by now. But I mean, enjoy it. Remember it. Document it. Because somebody down the road is going to be using it again, and you want to make sure that they don't go in and start adding email claims. So I guess that's it. And I should have timed this. I can't be too far off. And it's lunch, so you guys get to go and have lunch early. But does anybody have any questions? The slides? I will put them up. I'm sure, I know that this is being recorded. Whether or not they're going to make me share the slides someplace, I don't know. No, they don't require that you to share the slides, but I'll put them up on slide deck somewhere. And you've got my Twitter account. I'll tweet it up on Twitter where I'll upload it to. But I can do that. Anything else? Go have lunch? Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. There was one over here. I can barely see with the... Yeah. Identity Server 4, well, actually all of Identity Servers have something called the user info endpoint. And the user info endpoint is basically a place where you can put pretty much anything you want in there, but you could definitely overload the user info endpoint to re-add extra claims if you wanted to put it there, and that would actually make a lot of sense, because then when the application needed it, the application could go and specifically request it from the user info endpoint. But the main issue that I want to make here is that there should not be a coupling between the identity server and your API itself. That alone is that's probably a bad idea. So I would put an endpoint on your own API if you need this extra business data. Put it on your API someplace, because I like to keep things separate, and an identity server's only job should be to log in your users and identify your users. There should be no coupling. It has no business knowing your business data, in my opinion. There could be some reasons why you might want to do it, and you can. Like I said, look up the user info endpoint, and you can overload that. The user info endpoint, you log in, you send a bearer token with the access token, and it'll go in. If you come down after, I'll Google it for you and show you the on Identity Server 4 where it is. It's part of the documentation. Anything else? Lunchtime? Let's go have lunch.